you can never say there's a made in France controversy. This is one of them. This is really an instance of the wrong thing to say at the very wrong time. And I say the wrong time because the context is that, as we know, Emmanuel Macron, since he's been elected, has been the president who campaigned on reforming, fundamentally reforming the structure, even the way France thinks and approaches the world. And he's pushed through a raft of reforms. And even today, as we stand here speaking, his prime minister is meeting with representatives of France's unions about some of the critical sort of bread and butter issues, things like unemployment insurance, things about health and working conditions in the workplace. And he's coming up against a lot of resistance. The narrative all along has been that Emmanuel Macron is aloof, despite all of his fine words. He's a great orator, all of that. When push comes to shove, he's so determined to ram through his agenda that he doesn't really want to listen to us. That is the narrative from the unions, what's called in France the social partners, that the government is supposed to be listening to. And there are several days of talks right now going on. Here's the problem. Part of it is a personality problem. Emmanuel Macron is perceived as the so-called Jupiterian president, a sort of a god who's above the fray. He's above it all, self-convinced. There's an arrogance, a perceived arrogance in the way he goes about things. Obviously, Emmanuel Macron doesn't see it as all. As we saw in those comments, Emmanuel Macron really just thinks like he sees it as trying to express his philosophy. He thinks that it's not a contradiction to say that the French have historically, in many cases, they have been often resistant to change. Yet at the same time, he also says, I can recognize the French. I'm proud of the French culture. The French are proud of their culture. Why does that have to be opposed to also being open to the world? He says France is never really truly France and is never truly itself at those times in its history where it's closed to the world. So what you really have here is a case of two sides where it seems never the twain shall meet. It's sort of they're talking at each other rather than to each other.
And why is it that he mentioned the Gauls? Who were the Gauls?
Who are the Gauls? Well, how about, let's start with the most famous Gaul, okay? The Gaul that if you ask any French who knows nothing else about the Gauls, they know this one. Asterix, okay, the star protagonist of the famous French comic book series. There are over 100 of them. Who was he? Well, Asterix really was the leader of one small Gaul village in Roman times, actually right after the Roman conquest, okay, at about 50 BC. And he was a plucky, feisty, invincible, very cunning warrior with that trademark mustache. And how was he able? He was living in the only village able to resist the Romans, the Roman conquerors. And how? Because he had a secret potion. And that's the basis for these comics. And it's become a caricature, obviously, by definition. But the funny thing is you speak to people about the Gauls. Historians will say, and recently archaeologists have come up with things to suggest, the Gauls were not just a bunch of boar-eating, wine-swilling savages, heathens dwelling in the forest, going about roughing up Romans. They also actually were very sophisticated. They were craftsmen. They were traders. They were farmers. They had a culture of their own. Obviously, when the Romans came along and conquered them, they were slowly and gradually swallowed up. I just want to show you, though, at one time, this is why they're so big in France. Let's just bring the map up quickly. There were 5 regions in which they lived, and they were really a confederation of Celtic tribes. You had the Lyonnais region, the Narbonnais region, you had the Germanique region, you had the Aquitaine region, you had the Narbonnaise region. All of these separate but a confederation of these tribes, the Gauls, they were the precursors to everything that is at the bedrock of French identity. They were here before the Franks, okay? They were the originals. So often when you take a pot shot, as a lot of people think Macron just did, at the Gauls, as these lazy, change-resistant people, that hits a raw nerve among many French, and not just the French who love Asterix.